what I wanted to say at all. We have our video kind of highlighting Israel's history. If you've never been there, at the end of this, I'm just going to take maybe 5 or 10 minutes to introduce a presentation I have on going to Israel in May of 2022. And I've got some brochures for you to look at if you might be interested in that. So we're going to cue this up. Pastor Chris has gotten through Bo the rights to be able to share this video with you. It's about 30 minutes long. Again, it's kind of the history of Israel. And so if you want to cue that up, Bo, we'll start right now. Maybe. Whoops.
It was tense in Tel Aviv on May the 14th, 1948. It was a day of which all future Jewish generations would never cease to speak and dream, the day of Israel's birth. Many leaders of Palestine Jewry had been hesitant about proclaiming independence. Some feared that such a spectacular act might provoke war with uncertain consequence, but Ben-Gurion convened the leaders who decided by 6 against 4 to declare independence, come what may.
In a last-minute plea to avert war, Golda Meir met with King Abdullah of Transjordan, who turned her down, warning that he will join Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon in their invasion if a Jewish state is proclaimed.
David Ben-Gurion made an energetic entry and declaimed the proclamation on the rise of Israel in a firm and confident voice. There was a sense of high occasion. The applause was fervent.
In the modern history of Israel, we've lived a kind of a process of fluctuation, passing from a mood of celebration to moods of deep anxiety. We established our independence by the declaration of the 14th of May, 1948. But before our celebrations had died down, before the noise of festivities had subsided, there was a bombing of Israel the next morning by Egypt, and Arab forces began to converge upon us.
The Arab aim was the extinction of Israel. They would mock the very idea that a Jewish state could arise against the Arab will. Israel, less than 1 day old, was being attacked not by untrained volunteers, but by the armies of 6 sovereign Arab states, well-trained and lavishly equipped with British and French weaponry. The combined Arab armies had 35,000 men with modern armor and artillery.
The Jewish army, men, women, and high school students who face the Arab onslaught are mainly civilians, poorly equipped, barely trained, using faith and determination against overwhelming odds.
Our forces were now engaged on 3 fronts: in the north against the Syrians and Lebanese, in the center against the Iraqi army and the Transjordanian Arab Legion, and in the south against the formidable Egyptians. But Jerusalem was our greatest source of danger. On May the 18th, the Arab Legion had launched its assault on Jerusalem. It penetrated the old city, a knife thrust at Israel's heart. The fighting was house to house and hand to hand.
When the state was declared, I was not on the convoy. I commanded a brigade that fought in the besieged Jerusalem. It was a very bitter fighting. The brigade that I commanded suffered the highest number of casualties than any one of the other 12 brigades of the armed forces of Israel, of the IDF. I didn't think about the meaning of the state. I was completely preoccupied in the fighting in the besieged Jerusalem to prevent the annihilation of 80,000 Jews that were under the siege. thirsty for water, starving for food, shelled, fired at by snipers. This was what I thought about, not what would happen with the state later on. Then we fought for our survival in the real meaning of the word.
The teenagers between the ages of 12 and 14 were recruited to the Gadna, to the paramilitary service, and they performed functions of messengers, carrying notes, carrying ammunition. Some of them were hurt, were wounded, severely wounded. One of them lost his leg. They not only showed the bravery, they were actually better functioning than any grown-up could do.
On May the 28th, in Jerusalem, with only 300 rounds of ammunition left and only 36 fighting men still in action, the defenders of the old city had to surrender. Arabs looted the Jewish quarter, destroying dozens of synagogues in their wild rampage. Fewer than 1,200 civilians made their sad, weary way down the slopes of Mount Zion. Their wounds were tended. West Jerusalem fought on with valor against the Arab Legion, whose morale was now high. Its Jewish population was besieged, threatened with famine and thirst, isolated from the main body of the state, and subjected to an inferno of bombardment day and night.
When Jerusalem was under siege, we had reached a point which one of our commanders at that time, General Herzog, has portrayed.
Its water supplies had been cut off, and it was living only on what had been collected in the water cisterns. Everybody was living on 1 pail of water a day for all purposes, and about 3 slices of bread a day. That's all that was left in the city at the time.
It would be impossible to bring water, food, or ammunition into Jerusalem unless the heights commanding the approaches to the city from the coast could be captured by the Palmach troops. The Palmach attacked Castel across seemingly impassable hills and rocks. Ben-Gurion was implacable in demanding this costly effort. It was decided to try to seize Latrun, formerly a British police stronghold where the Arab Legion was entrenched.
We were thrown into battle at Latrun in order to try to open the road to Jerusalem. Even though the forces in which I personally participated, such as the 7th Brigade, were not ready to go into battle. They had not been trained, they didn't know each other. Some of them had just come off the boats as immigrants from Cyprus. I don't know if they really knew how to handle a rifle or not.
These untrained troops were thrown into the inferno, attacking, retreating, attacking again and again. Despite their gallantry in carrying out a difficult order, they failed to break through. After the fall of the old city, Israel had to absorb another defeat.
We didn't succeed. Ben-Gurion was very heavily criticized for this decision.
For while Jerusalem was our main anxiety, we were heavily engaged in resisting dangerous enemy pressures in the north and in the south. In the north, the focus of our disquiet was Degania, known as the mother of the kibbutz movement, founded in 1910. It was a powerful symbol for all Israelis. The Syrians had attacked at dawn on May the 20th with heavy artillery fire. Syrian tanks broke through Degania's defenses, and were set afire by Molotov cocktails thrown by the kibbutzniks at short range.
For 4 days, the farmers of Kibbutz Degania thwart repeated Syrian armored attacks, destroy tanks using Molotov cocktails, and hold the northern front.
While Degania and Jerusalem were in deadly hazard, there was a third point of peril in the south. The Egyptians were advancing relentlessly along the coast. Their proximity to Tel Aviv was alarming. On May the 19th, the Egyptian army had reached the tiny kibbutz of Yad Mordechai. It was reluctantly decided to remove the women and children to safety. There were 4 separate assaults by the Egyptians in a single day. The Arab aim was the extinction of Israel.
In his first speech in the Security Council, Abba Eban asserts Israel's independence.
If the Arab states want peace with Israel, they can have it. If they want war, they can have that too. But whether they want peace or war, they can have it only with the independent, sovereign state of Israel. By May the 23rd, the defenders were running short of ammunition. They couldn't hold out. In the dawn of May the 24th, the survivors of Yad Mordechai left their ruined village.
Because of the bravery of the settlers on the way, who did not evacuate, the Egyptians advanced very hesitantly. The Egyptians advanced nevertheless, and they reached the area of Isdud, which is today the site of the town of Ashdod. The Givati Brigade, which played a major part in blocking the Egyptian army, moved into action.
In the early part of June, our forces had been made breathless by the sheer ferocity of their battles. I received a rare phone call from Ben Gurion. I hope to get a Security Council meeting in a few days. The Prime Minister said gravely, "Not quick enough. It is a matter of hours."
A promise of peace for at least 4 weeks comes to the Holy Land. Jews and Arabs reach a truce that could restore embattled Jerusalem as a free place of worship for 3 faiths.
The only hope of rescuing West Jerusalem from starvation was by building a road at breakneck speed through ostensibly impassable Judean hills. But what we needed more than anything else was a respite in which we could regroup and train and refresh our weary troops. The truce was to come into force on June the 14th. United Nations observers were to see that no movement to anyone's advantage would occur once the truce was in effect. For 3 days, we strove to bring the New Jerusalem Road to completion. It was a desperate race against time. With 1 hour left, the race was won.
First, free convoy to Jerusalem. Climbing up to Jerusalem early in the morning. We were soldiers and we kissed each other, we hugged each other. It was almost a bless of God.
On the first trucks in that first convoy that broke through, there was a Hebrew inscription, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its cunning."
This was an unbelievable saga of heroism. I don't think that people can even envisage what happened in a completely hopeless situation in which sheer guts combined with leadership and are willing to make the supreme sacrifice by everybody, without exception, finally won the day.
There was now a respite, time to honor the dead and to thank the fighting men. The United Nations Security Council had performed a great benefit in enforcing the truce. The truce gave our forces an opportunity to regain strength. Rest and exercise fashioned a more efficient army, trained to the sharpest edge. At the same time, copious quantities of ammunition and equipment were brought in, chiefly from Czechoslovakia. New branches of the service, such as paratroopers, were inaugurated. An air force was born. In the winter of 1948 and 1949, the camps in Cyprus where the British had held thousands of immigrants were emptied, and the internees were finally brought home. Ships from all over the world could now freely carry anyone who wished to join us in the nation's defense. Foreign volunteers under the name of Machal flocked to us from all over the world. Some of the more cherished volunteers had flying experience with the British Royal Air Force. The birth of the Israeli Air Force during this struggle for survival was attended by irony.
Cynically as history can be sometimes, we fought for the creation of the Jewish state after 2,000 years in the German Messerschmitt 109, chasing British-built Spitfires flown by the Egyptian Air Force mainly. So we got German-built airplanes from the communists to fight against British-built Spitfires. I took part in one very nice dogfight with the RAF. My belly was going upside down when I saw so many Egyptians so near to Tel Aviv, where I was born.
A modest naval component was assembled at Haifa and manned by sailors who had seen service in somewhat more formidable fleets.
The beach at Tel Aviv becomes a battlefield. In the first serious breach in the new Israeli nation, Irgun extremists clash with the government over a shipload of ammunition. As United Nations observers look on, Irgunists try to unload the American-made LST on the beach. But rather than permit violation of the UN-imposed truce between Jew and Arab, Israeli soldiers fire on the ship and its much-needed cargo. Brother fights brother in the confusion of skirmish along the bloody beach. The ship is fired and the arms and ammunition go up in a series of explosions. Falling debris imperils men escaping from the burning vessel. The forces of order finally prevail as Israel passes its first serious internal crisis.
The pain and the scars and the rancor left behind by this event would cut deep into the consciousness of Israel, but most historians believe that Israeli sovereignty was born on that day. One of the most important results of this grave incident was that all military forces in Israel, including the Palmach, as well as the Irgun and Lechi, now became united in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. There was something suicidal in the Arab decision to renew the fighting on July the 9th against an Israeli army refreshed and replenished by the truce. Israel responded reluctantly but dynamically. In the next 10 days, Egypt lost over 700 killed, 1,000 wounded, and hundreds of prisoners.
Facing a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Israelis, the Arab states call for an urgent meeting of the Security Council.
It must stop. A vote is taken, and the Security Council orders both sides to stop the war in Palestine under pain of economic sanctions and military intervention. There's quick agreement by Prime Minister Ben-Gurion's government of Israel, and the truce is accepted by King Abdullah's Transjordania and the other Arab states.
During the summer of 1948, the United Nations mediator, Count Volker Bernadotte of Sweden, had been formulating a design for what he called a permanent settlement. He met with Arab and Jewish leaders. In his first plan, he proposed to limit Jewish immigration, to award Jerusalem and the Negev to the Arab state, and to make Haifa a free port. The effrontery of this proposal left us breathless. I said in the United Nations that it was like a surgeon who runs away with his patient's vital organs under the pretense of curing him. It would be charitable to believe that the coincidence of these proposals with Britain's strategic interests was a matter of chance. The Israeli decision was to reject Bernadotte's plan. His end was sudden, unexpected, and tragic.
His unrelenting search for a solution ended abruptly and tragically on the afternoon of September 17th, 1948. The world was shocked by the news of his assassination in Jerusalem by 3 members of the Jewish terror underground known as the Stern Gang.
United Nations observers were active on all fronts. In the Negev, where Beersheba was still in the hands of the Egyptians, the Israelis advanced with all their forces. they were at pains to see that no military stores or arms were being illegally transported. At the end of 1948, 11 Jewish settlements in the Negev were still cut off, needing food to survive. When an Israeli relief convoy was attacked, the truce had clearly been broken. The Israeli hold on the Negev was being challenged. Our soldiers responded heavily.
Jewish soldiers are rushed into action to reopen blockaded supply routes to their desert settlements.
They headed for the Egyptian base at Beersheba.
Israeli columns rolling in from the north take the ancient stronghold to command a strategic area along their lifelines to the southern desert. Egyptian war material falls to the victorious Israelis. But the defending soldiers brace themselves for counterattack when warplanes of Egypt strike back at the city. Here, small arms fire is used for protection. Again, war takes its toll of dead and wounded. But the Israeli army has gained a signal victory. Egypt's offensive power has been severely crippled, her Palestine bases isolated, and many of her soldiers captured. After a week of warfare, guns are silenced by United Nations action. But after the struggle, Israel's position in the desert land of the Negev is established more firmly than ever before.
Only one Egyptian stronghold, Fallujah, was left there. Besieged in it was a young Egyptian captain, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Beyond Fallujah, our victorious forces now pressed on across the border into Egypt itself. This was too much for the British, who still had a base in Egypt. They issued an ultimatum: withdraw or we shall force you to withdraw. Ben-Gurion agreed, but not before 5 British planes had been shot down by our Air Force. In the north, there remained the Lebanese army and the more threatening Syrians. The Lebanese refused battle, and by the last day in October, the Syrians had been vanquished. Galilee was firmly in Israeli hands. Ben-Gurion had been probing for an Arab-Israeli peace move. On January the 13th, 1949, negotiations for an armistice began on the island of Rhodes, conducted by the new United Nations mediator, Dr. Ralph Bunche. An agreement was reached 6 difficult weeks later.
It was with Egypt setting the example that the others followed. It is doubtful whether any of the other countries, Lebanon, Jordan, or Syria, would have had the political clout or the political courage to enter into armistice negotiations with us, even at the behest of the Security Council, if Egypt had not set the example.
These successful armistice negotiations have demonstrated conclusively the ability of the United Nations to mediate a serious conflict and to avert a dangerous threat to the peace.
With United Nations mediation, the young state of Israel and its Arab neighbors conclude an armistice pact, and the victorious Israeli army stages a well-deserved victory parade.
The war for the destruction of Israel's independence had some inevitable effects upon the condition of those Arabs who chose to remain and become citizens of Israel. On the one hand, they had juridical equality. They could elect members to the Knesset. They could, if they wanted, be represented in our parliament at the precise level of their demographic strength. They were equal before the law. On the other hand, their sympathies went out to their kinsmen across the border. But the fact is there was a very great level and a very great sector of normality in the relationship between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. The war that the Arabs launched against Israel created two parallel refugee problems. On the one hand, there was the Arab refugee problem, created as a result of the flight of the Arabs from the consequences of the war which their leaders had launched. And on the other side, there were 800,000 Jews in the Arab countries who became refugees because the hatred that was directed against them in those countries made it impossible for them to remain. What is different, however, is the way in which the two parties related to their refugee problems. Israel treated the Jewish refugees from Arab countries as citizens, as kinsmen, integrated them into the workforce and into the political system, gave them citizenship as soon as they arrived, and took very strong measures in order to ensure their speedy acceptance into our social and economic framework. The Arabs, on the other hand, regarded the refugees as a political opportunity. They considered, and this prediction was borne out, that if they could keep them in squalor and in misery, in a sense of frustration and desperation, so that their plight would cry out to the conscience of the world, they would thereby alienate Israel from world opinion and create pressure for the entry of those refugees into Israel without peace, that is to say, in conditions in which their entry would create a time bomb.
The issue here is that once you admit that Arab governments launched the war, once you accept the axiom that this refugee problem arose from that war and would not have arisen without it, then you prove by the simplest laws of truth and logic that the Arab governments bear primary responsibility for the creation of this refugee problem. You cannot let loose a war and wash your hands of all responsibility for its tragic consequences.
Those Arabs were there because of right. They are descendants of the very people who lived in Palestine for thousands of years, even before the Jews were there. If some people come from without with a design to occupy their country, to build a state, now where is the responsibility? Whose responsibility is it?
Israel bears no responsibility for a war which it opposed, which it repeatedly yearned to end, and therefore it does not bear the responsibility for the consequences of that war, either for the suffering inflicted by the aggressor in his attack or the defender in his response. We shall do whatever we can earnestly within the limits of our capacity to help alleviate the problem which this aggression has caused.
I wasn't paying attention to when he was going to end. You know, I was just looking at the UN Council. You can see a lot of things haven't changed, have they? In 60 or 70 years. They're still arguing to this day, and I think probably until Christ returns, there won't be peace in that area, if you've ever been there. So the next few minutes... well, first of all, let me do this. Next week, Pastor Chris is not going to be here again. He extended his vacation one more week. And we're going to be doing what I'm calling and he's calling a flyover of the book of Revelation to end the Sunday school. So we're going to just kind of do a summary. We're going to try to do it in an hour. I'll be talking much faster than I am right now. To get through 22 chapters, but we're going to do the best we can. Bo, is this on here? It's not. It's on. It's still saying the Living in Hope and Mystery Island VBS, which are all really important, but they're not my presentation. So anyway, while he's doing that, this is the brochure many of you have seen. Some of you actually in here have been to Israel with me. or maybe you've been on your own, but we're doing another trip again next May, and I thought it would be appropriate to share with you a little bit about that particular trip. It's a 12-day, I call it vacation with a purpose. I create a devotional that goes for each day. But what's particularly important about this, or exciting about this particular trip, thank you, this particular trip, is that we are going to Oberammergau in Germany at the end of it. If you know anything about Oberammergau, they are the German city that puts on a passion play every 10 years. They've been doing it for 500 years. The story behind it is that they prayed to God and said, if you'll get rid of the plague, we will do a passion play from that point forward. And the next year, the plague was out of their city, and they committed to doing this passion play. And that was back in the 1500s. And so last year, because of COVID, they they moved it for only the second time in its 500-year history. And they're doing it now in 2022. So that's an addition in this trip. If you're interested in this trip, I've got the brochures up here. I'm going to go through this really quick. So on day 1 and 2, behind me the slides, we fly from Seattle to Israel. We arrive and we stay in Tel Aviv, the Ramada Resort in Hadera. Traditionally, we stay in actually kibbutzes. I don't know if you heard them talk about that in the video. A kibbutz is basically communal living. It's families that have gotten together. They have a business. They live together. They pool their resources together. And there's a variety of kibbutzes throughout Israel. They're not as popular as they used to be, but there's one at the south end of the Sea of Galilee, the Ma'agan, that we usually stay at. We're not going to be staying there this year, but it's a wonderful place. They treat you well. They feed you well. And it's a beautiful setting on the southern shores of the Sea of Galilee. The next day, we're going to be going to Caesarea. This is a city built by King Herod, right along the Mediterranean. We visit the little town, not as little now, called Nazareth. We know why that's important. And then we also visit an archaeological dig, Megiddo. It's mentioned in Revelation. It's the end-timed battle. The Battle of Armageddon is right near where Megiddo stands. The next day, I'm just going very quickly through this, we go to Caesarea Philippi. This is where Peter professes Christ as the Lord. It's important that he does it here because Caesarea Philippi has all kinds of different shrines to different gods. And so it would be important that Peter would do that there and proclaim Jesus as God at that place. That would have been a really important place for him to do that. That middle picture is actually a temple carved out into the stone. We also visit Dan. This is called Abraham Entrance. It's an entrance to the city of Dan in northern Israel. We get all excited here in America about digs that are 200 and 300 years old. That's like yesterday compared to Israel. So I say this because this particular entrance in Dan is about 4,000 years old. We also visit Capernaum, one of the cities that Jesus ministered to. It's not the actual synagogue that he would have been at because that one was destroyed. But you'll see the foundation of that synagogue. They built the newer synagogue, I say newer, within 1,000 years. The Sea of Galilee, of course, and then the Mount Beatitudes where Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. The next day, we go to Bet Shen. Bet Shen is an archaeological dig, but it's also a current city. It's where Saul hung his headless body, or he didn't do it. His body was hung. We visit the Jordan River, where there's a baptismal site, if somebody would like to be baptized. And then we also go to the most unique water in the world. We go to the Dead Sea. It's impossible to sink, as it's 33% salinity. And so we go there that day. We go from northern to southern Israel. And then we move our way towards the other southern parts. We go to Masada, which is there's a great story about Masada I won't get into. We go to the Dead Sea to see where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. En-Gedi. En-Gedi is, of course, where King David hid out from Saul. And then we also see kind of what it would have been like maybe as a nomad living with Abraham, which, by the way, that's my least favorite part, is this reenactment of Abraham. And I can go into a story of what you can ask me why later. There's a really kind of humorous story of a couple people getting bucked off a camel, which was not funny at the time, which is funny now. Then we visit Jerusalem. We go up to Jerusalem, which is actually literally going up, not north, but actually physically going up. And we visit St. Anne's Church, the likes of the Temple Mount, potentially, the Zion Gate, and other. The middle one there, of course, is the Dome of the Rock, the third most holy place for the Muslims. And then we go to some of the other things that we'll see in Jerusalem are Mount Moriah. Of course, Mount Moriah is where Jerusalem was built. It also is where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac. And then we visit the bottom left corner there are a couple thousand-year-old trees, the olive trees, the Garden of Gethsemane. And then we visit these rabbinical tunnels that they've dug underneath the wall that are pretty incredible as well. And then we visit also the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the places that they think Jesus might have been buried. And the southern wall excavations, of course, are where the Israelites would have come throughout time to do their sacrifices. This would have been a very bloody spot. It's where the priests would have done all of the sacrifices of the animals. And then we visit an alternate place for where maybe Jesus was buried called the Garden Tomb. It's a non-profit garden that has a very, not a replica, it's actually got a tomb that would have looked very similar to what Jesus would have been buried in. And then we fly from Israel, Ben Gurion Airport. Of course, you heard Ben Gurion, the leader of Israel at the time in the late 1940s. He's got his own airport named after him. We fly to Germany. We'll visit the Olympic Stadium, the Royal Palace, the new town hall, and then finally we will see the Passion Play production. And to round it off, we will fly across the country back home. That is the fastest I have ever given that presentation. So it can be done. If you have questions, I'm going to close in prayer. We got a couple minutes. We're ending a couple minutes early on purpose. If you want to look at this, just for your own information, please come up. You can ask questions. Love to answer those questions. For now, we'll see you next week, last Sunday for Sunday school. We're going to do a flyover, and it's like a 50,000-foot flyover of the book of Revelation, starting with Revelation 1 and moving into 22. So let's pray to close this off this morning, and we'll go from there. Lord, thank you for this time together. Thank you for each one who has come faithfully week in and week out. It's awesome to be able to go through a book of the Bible verse by verse together and ask questions and sharpen each other and continue to grow in our faith. And now I just pray we take this knowledge and we'll take it out to the world and share our hope with them. And we pray and ask these things in your name. Amen. All right. Have a